So I'd like to take you back 60 years to 1961. The Congress on Racial Equality, CORE, announced a new movement called the Freedom Rides. And they were able to recruit a group of 13 black and white young people to get on buses in Washington, D.C. with the purpose of riding interstate buses all the way through the South to New Orleans. Things were going pretty well, and they were doing this to test a ruling by the Supreme Court that said segregation not only on interstate buses, but also on interstate bus terminals was unconstitutional. And they were doing great until they got to Alabama. And then things went nuts. When the bus got into Alabama, one of the buses, and they were on two, got met with a mob of 200 angry white people. They blockaded the bus, sliced the tires, actually firebombed the bus. And you can find images of this, of the Freedom Riders scurrying off the bus as smoke is billowing from the windows. Thankfully, people escaped with only minor injuries. The other bus, however, they were not so lucky. They actually got all the way to Birmingham. And when they got to the bus station, they were met by an angry mob with iron pipes and clubs. They started beating the Freedom Riders. One had 50 stitches. Another, a guy named William Barbee, an African-American Freedom Rider, had permanent brain damage from what happened in Birmingham. After trying to figure out if they could keep going, the resolve of those Freedom Riders carried on, and they decided they were going to keep going to Montgomery. And the governor instituted a police escort all the way from Birmingham to Montgomery, Alabama. But right when they got to the border of Montgomery, the police left. And once again, there was an eerie feeling as they made their way to the Montgomery City bus terminal, where again an angry mob met them. John Siegenthaler, who was an assistant to Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was beaten unconscious at that stop. John Lewis, a full 3 years before the tragic days of Bloody Sunday at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, was knocked out himself that day in Montgomery. Well, the movement decided they had to do something, and they gathered in Montgomery on the evening of May 21st, 1961. Over 1,000 people crowded into First Baptist Church to get some sustenance and to support the Freedom Riders. And one of those speakers was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here are some of his prepared remarks I'd like to share with you. And whenever you hear the words Alabama, I want you to think about what's happened in the last 2 weeks, and in your mind replace the words United States and see if these words don't have a poignancy for today in 2021. Here's Dr. King's words. Over the past few days, Alabama has been the scene of a literal reign of terror. Now, who is responsible for this dark night of terror in Alabama? Certainly the mob itself must be condemned. When people sink to such a low level of hatred and evil that they will beat unmercifully nonviolent men and women, they should be apprehended and prosecuted on the basis of the crime they have committed. But the ultimate responsibility for the hideous action in Alabama last week must be placed at the doorsteps of the governor of this state. His consistent preaching of defiance of the law, his vitriolic public pronouncements, and his irresponsible actions created the atmosphere in which violence could thrive. When the governor of a state will urge people to defy the law of the land and teach them to disrespect the Supreme Court, he is consciously and unconsciously aiding and abetting the forces of violence. The Freedom Riders have given us a magnificent example of strong, courageous action devoid of violence. So in the days ahead, let us not sink into the quicksands of violence. Rather, let us stand on the high ground of love. Now, this was a poignant time for everyone because the violence the king was describing did not end that day. It was not something that happened in the past. In fact, there was a mob with 1,000 people worshiping inside First Baptist. There was a mob of over 3,000 white people that laid siege on First Baptist Church that night for hour after hour after hour. Robert Kennedy had sent in U.S. Marshals who were the only line of defense between that mob and those freedom fighters inside First Baptist. And that mob was throwing rocks and burning cars and creating all sorts of chaos. And trust me, when that mob was striking, had they got through those U.S. Marshals, there was no safe room. There were no Secret Service people to usher Dr. King or Diane Nash or Ralph Abernathy or John Lewis to safety. It would have been tragic. Eventually, the governor called in reinforcements. And after hour, they finally were able to leave at like 4 a.m. But in the midst of that terror, Dr. King said these words to those 1,000 people huddled inside under siege. Dr. King said, "Now we've had an ugly mob outside. They have injured some of the federal marshals. They've burned some automobiles, but we're not giving in for what we are standing for. And maybe it takes something like this for the federal government to see that Alabama is not going to place any limit upon itself. It must be imposed from without. The first thing we must do here tonight is decide that we aren't going to panic, that we're going to be calm, and that we're going to continue to stand up for what we know is right. And Alabama will have to face the fact that we are determined to be free." The main thing I want to say to you is fear not. We've gone too far to turn back. Let us be calm. We are together. We are not afraid, and we shall overcome.